Conan O'Brien did not even have to try. That is the thing about the best roast lines. Sometimes the joke is just sitting there waiting for someone to say it out loud, and Conan picked it up like it had been left on the table specifically for him.
Don't think they will change because I don't think they have the capacity to, but they obviously should.
Meghan's jam brand, the whole American Riviera orchard, Martha Stewart fantasy, the gift boxes, the candles, the whole carefully styled lifestyle empire. Conan summed up the entire situation with one line that landed so cleanly it spread across the internet within hours. No build-up needed, no elaborate setup, just the punchline, sitting right there waiting, and Conan delivered it like he barely had to reach for it.
But my dad got out of copping and then became a food broker, which we're like, come on, that's
What?
CIA, right?
Yes.
And he's
food
like, no,
brokers.
I really am a middleman for jars of jam.
He worked for Meghan Markle.
And honestly, that is what makes it sting more than the angrier takedowns. When a joke about you requires almost no effort, that tells you something about how the story has already written itself in the public mind before the comedian even opens his mouth. He's not building a case, he's just narrating what everyone already privately thinks. Conan has actually been circling this territory for a while now. Back when the Oprah interview was dominating every headline on the planet, back when you couldn't turn on a television without hearing the word racism attached to a royal family member's name, he was already taking playful shots at the situation, and those clips traveled fast because they were sharp without being cruel. Conan has this gift for landing a joke that feels observational rather than vindictive, which somehow makes it cut deeper. This time felt different though. This time the humor was not something a PR team could easily reshape or spin into something more flattering. There was no obvious counter-narrative available. It just landed and stayed landed, the way jokes do when they're describing something that's simply observably true.
Loving home, and I treat them better than the museum ever did. They didn't appreciate Meghan's soft hands or Harry's supple lips. They are in a loving home, Conan, and I treat them better than the museum ever did. They didn't appreciate Meghan's soft hands or Harry's supple lips.
Then he did something genuinely strange and genuinely memorable, the kind of bit that becomes a clip people send each other for weeks. He built an entire sketch around the Madame Tussauds wax figures of Meghan and Harry, and not just a passing mention, not a quick visual gag. He invented a fictional museum employee whose entire job apparently consisted of looking after these two wax statues, and the sketch ran with these increasingly absurd imagined conversations about what it's like to store them, move them around the museum, deal with the logistics of two life-sized royal mannequins on a daily basis. It kept escalating in that way the best sketch comedy always does. Every new beat pushed the absurdity a little further, introduced a new wrinkle, found a new angle on the same basic premise. And by the end, people were not just laughing in the moment. They were quoting it back days later, building their own versions of the bit online, keeping it alive well past the original broadcast. That is the actual mark of a sketch that worked. Not whether it gets a laugh in the room, but whether people are still bringing it up at the water cooler a week on, still sending each other the clip, still riffing on the premise themselves.
Tiny jams, harvestable jam made from the oils of Montecito.
Now here's where the night took an unexpected turn, because the comedy stopped being just comedy for a second and edged into something genuinely uncomfortable. Jimmy Carr brought up something that almost nobody says out loud in polite company, certainly not on a comedy stage in front of a live audience. The line of succession. Specifically, and stay with me here because this is the part that got everyone shifting in their seats a little, what happens to that line if King Charles passes and, in some unthinkable nobody actually wants this scenario, something also happened to William and Catherine. Suddenly, Harry is a lot closer to the throne than anyone, including Harry himself probably is comfortable imagining. Carr framed it as a constitutional thought experiment, dark hypothetical comedy, the kind of joke that's built entirely on a premise nobody actually wants to see happen, but that exists purely as a structural curiosity about how succession mechanics work.
Brilliant about what she's doing is she knows people want to spend money, and spending money makes them feel like they're getting something that's better, even though it might not necessarily be true.
That's classic Carr territory. He's always been the comedian willing to go to the place everyone else tiptoes around, deliver it with total deadpan precision, and let the discomfort do half the work for him. But the room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when a joke has touched something real underneath the laugh. Not offended quiet, recognition quiet. The kind of silence that happens when a comedian says the thing that's been sitting unspoken in the collective consciousness, and suddenly everyone has to actually process it rather than just laugh reflexively. We'll come back to that one in a minute, because there's more to unpack there once we've worked through the rest of the night.
You can tell when you watch the show, she thinks just we're all animals and we're all just kind of pigs in the mud, and that she's helping us with jam and honey.
But first, the Osbournes had their say, and they did not hold back even slightly, which honestly tracks given their entire family's history of saying the quiet part loud. Kelly Osbourne called Prince Harry a twat. On television. Just said it plainly, no cushioning, no careful diplomatic wording, no walking it back afterward. And maybe the wildest part of that moment, the part that actually says more than the insult itself, is how unremarkable it has become as a piece of news. Years ago, a comment like that about a senior royal, even a former one, even one who's been publicly distancing himself from the institution, would have caused genuine shockwaves, generated days of follow-up coverage, prompted statements and counter-statements. Now it is Tuesday's headline, absorbed into the news cycle without anyone particularly blinking, filed away alongside a dozen other stories about the same two people.
Decided to re-air all the same advertisements that they had aired here in America, but they adjusted the ads slightly for British audiences. I thought that was strange. Take a look.
Ancestry.com for the British royal family. Find out which second cousin you're accidentally dating.
Oreo biscuits. There's a black and white marriage we can all agree on.
I thought the Oreo ad was unnecessary. They didn't need it.
That alone tells you something about how far the public conversation has shifted and how normalized this level of directness toward Harry specifically has become. Kelly's actual argument underneath the insult was more substantive than the soundbite suggests, and I think it's worth pulling apart properly rather than just leaving it at the swear word. Her point was about opportunity, fundamentally. Netflix, Spotify, full production teams, enormous budgets, a worldwide platform, more media attention, and more institutional support than almost anyone on the planet gets handed in an entire lifetime, let alone in the space of a few years. Her position, stripped of the colorful language, was actually pretty simple and pretty hard to argue with on its face. The resources were never the problem. The problem was whether what they made with those resources actually connected with anyone beyond the people who were already paying attention out of curiosity about the royal drama itself.
Meghan Markle is, of course, a lifelong feminist, which she's demonstrated by marrying a prince and giving up her job.
Sharon jumped in right after with her own grenade, and between the two of them, it became a genuine two-pronged family takedown that probably had publicists on both sides of the Atlantic reaching for coffee. Sharon went after the way Meghan described meeting the late Queen, a story that's been told and retold in various interviews over the years, with the details shifting slightly each time, arguing the account had been dramatized well past what Sharon believed actually happened in that room, and that the tone of it came across as not quite respectful enough for the gravity of the occasion it was supposedly describing. Two Osbournes, two completely separate angles of attack, same week, same target, and neither one of them showing the slightest interest in softening the delivery for the cameras.
Been handed the world and every major contract, you had podcasts, you have all of this, and you didn't deliver because
there's nothing to deliver.
Yeah, because you don't have it, and that's okay. And I think they do have a right to privacy, but that doesn't seem to me what they're looking.
If you're enjoying this one, the like button helps more than you'd think. It's basically the only thing keeping this channel in front of people who'd actually want to see it. And if you're new here, this is what we do every week, going through the latest comedy, commentary, and cultural moments around this family without pretending to be more neutral about it than we actually are. Now let's talk about the Golden Globes, because this is where the comedy went from scattered jabs across different shows and different weeks to something closer to a coordinated cultural moment, all happening in a single room on a single night, broadcast to the entire world simultaneously. Joe Coy opened with a Netflix joke that became one of the most talked about lines of the entire night, replayed across every entertainment news channel by the following morning. Not subtle, not gentle. A direct hit on the gap between what that deal promised when it was first announced, the access, the insight, the prestige content, and what it actually delivered once the cameras started rolling and the numbers started coming in. And the room's reaction told you everything you needed to know without anyone having to write a think piece about it. Some genuine surprised laughs, some uncomfortable silence from tables that clearly had business relationships in that direction, the exact split you'd expect from a joke that's funny precisely because it's grounded in something true rather than invented for shock value. Then Family Guy got in on it with an animated parody, and here's the thing about that specific kind of cultural marker that people sometimes miss. Shows like that only bother lampooning you once you've become genuinely unavoidable in the broader culture. Nobody wastes animation budget, writer's room time, and a whole episode segment on people nobody's actually thinking about anymore. Being a Family Guy punchline is its own strange kind of confirmation that you've become permanent furniture in the public conversation, whether you wanted that particular kind of permanence or not. It's not exactly a compliment, but it's not nothing either. Nikki Glaser came in with her trademark "no mercy, take no prisoners" delivery, the style that's made her one of the most feared roasters working right now. Meghan, the 1000th from Sherman Oaks, barista, stop. And then straight into the bit about how marrying Harry completely rewired the trajectory of her entire life. Took her from one category of celebrity entirely into another, bigger, stranger one overnight. Brutal, exaggerated, exactly Glaser's lane. Delivered with the kind of confidence that doesn't leave room for the audience to feel bad about laughing. The room genuinely ate it up. The kind of response where you can hear the laughter building rather than landing flat. Tim Dillon, never one to hold back on anything regardless of subject matter, compared Meghan to the ultimate Real Housewife. Constant headlines, non-stop manufactured drama, the spotlight that never actually goes away, it just keeps relocating to bigger and bigger stages with higher production values. That's a Dillon read through and through. Provocative, exaggerated, built specifically to get a reaction rather than deliver some kind of balanced, fair-minded take on the situation. He also went after Harry's military service and what Dillon clearly sees as a fundamental disconnect between the soldier persona that defined Harry's public image for years and everything that came after. The interviews, the memoir, the entire media machine that's been running ever since. Pure opinion, delivered the way Dillon delivers everything, like he's actively daring you to disagree with him out loud. Bill Maher took a different angle entirely, and his commentary carried a particular kind of weight specifically because Maher is not exactly a reflexive monarchist or some tabloid troll looking for cheap engagement. He zeroed in on what he saw as genuine contradictions, public statements that did not quite line up with the decisions made afterward, the gap between the stated reasons for leaving and the subsequent commercial choices. And a lot of people who do not normally agree with Maher on much of anything found themselves nodding along to this particular monologue almost despite themselves. He went further too, into a broader point about how some public figures package personal struggle in a way that simultaneously signals resilience and invites public sympathy, and where exactly the line sits between genuinely raising awareness about real issues and just circling back to the same grievance again and again for commercial or narrative purposes. What's genuinely interesting about Maher weighing in is what it signals about how wide this conversation has gotten beyond its original boundaries. This is someone who leans progressive on plenty of social and cultural issues, who is not coming at this from some traditionalist royalist angle or some inherent skepticism of people who leave institutions. When someone like that starts publicly questioning the messaging and the inconsistencies, it stops looking like a predictable left versus right culture war thing and starts looking like something closer to genuine cross-spectrum consensus fatigue. John Oliver, of all people, also threw in a joke, and the reason it landed differently from almost everything else in this entire roundup is precisely because Oliver almost never goes there. He's usually far more measured, far more careful about where he points his satire, generally reserving his sharpest material for institutional and political targets rather than individual celebrities navigating personal family drama. So when he did make a crack about the couple, people noticed specifically because it was so out of character for him, so unlike his usual targeting. That contrast, a comedian known for restraint choosing to engage at all, is its own kind of evidence about where the cultural needle has moved. And then there's Spitting Image, the long-running British satirical institution that's been lampooning royals, politicians, and public figures of every stripe since before most of today's audience was even born. Their take leaned into the idea that Meghan and Harry exist in this permanent overlap zone, half celebrity world, half constant media circus, never quite fully one or the other, which is honestly one of the more precise reads on their actual public image that's come out of any of this comedy season, buried inside a puppet sketch. Back to Jimmy Carr's Succession joke for a second, because I think it deserves more attention than just a passing mention in a broader roundup, and because it's actually the most structurally interesting joke of the whole night, even if it's not the funniest. What made it land wasn't really the dark hypothetical itself. Comedians have always played with morbid what-ifs about royal succession. That's nothing new. That genre of dark royal humor has been around for decades. Carr himself has done versions of this kind of premise before with other royals. What made this specific iteration land was the timing and the context it arrived in, the specific cultural moment it dropped into. Carr wasn't just making a random dark joke in a vacuum, detached from everything else happening around it. He was making it in the middle of an entire cultural moment where Harry's relationship to the institution, his credibility, his actual fitness for any kind of prominent constitutional role has already been under sustained and very public scrutiny for years at this point. The joke worked specifically because the audience already had a frame for it sitting ready in their heads. Nobody had to explain the subtext. Nobody needed a primer on why the premise was uncomfortable. The discomfort was preloaded before Carr even got to the punchline, which meant he could deliver it completely deadpan and let the audience do the heavy lifting themselves. And technically, constitutionally, the premise is genuinely real even if it's astronomically unlikely to ever actually matter. Harry is still in the line of succession. Far down it, yes, practically irrelevant in any realistic scenario anyone is actually worried about. But the mechanism itself genuinely exists on paper. That sliver of actual constitutional reality is exactly what gave Carr's joke its edge over a purely fictional premise. It wasn't pure fantasy dreamed up for shock value. It was an absurd extrapolation built on top of something technically, legally true. That combination, real foundation, absurd extrapolation, is usually the exact recipe for the jokes that actually stick in people's minds, rather than just getting a laugh and disappearing. There's also something worth noting about why this particular comedian, with this particular delivery style, was the one who could pull it off. Carr's entire brand is built around saying the unsayable with total emotional flatness, letting the words themselves carry all the shock value while his own face and tone stay completely neutral. A more emotionally invested comedian trying this exact same joke would have come across as either mean-spirited or like they were fishing for outrage. Carr's deadpan made it feel almost clinical, almost like he was just reading out a fact pattern rather than constructing a punchline. And that clinical quality is precisely what let the audience laugh without feeling like they were laughing at something genuinely cruel. Even though, underneath it, the premise involves multiple deaths in a family that's already been through enough public tragedy for several lifetimes. Here's what ties this entire wave of comedy together, and I think it's genuinely worth saying directly, rather than just leaving it as a list of separate incidents. This isn't really about celebrity gossip in the traditional throwaway sense. Comedians don't typically dedicate this much stage time across this many different shows, this many wildly different comedic styles, this many different political leanings and audience demographics to people they fundamentally think are sympathetic figures being unfairly piled on. Conan, the Osbournes, Joe Coy, Maher, Dillon, Glaser, Carr, Oliver, Spitting Image. These are wildly different comedic sensibilities, different audiences, different countries even, operating in completely separate creative ecosystems with no coordination between them whatsoever, and they're all circling the same basic conclusion from completely different directions and completely different starting points. That convergence is the actual story here, more than any single individual punchline, not any one joke landing particularly hard. The fact that this many unrelated voices, with this many unrelated audiences and unrelated incentive structures and zero financial reason to coordinate with each other, keep arriving independently at the same basic read of the situation without any visible coordination at all. When that many different comedic perspectives converge on the same target from the same general direction across multiple continents and multiple decades of comedy tradition. That's not really about any one joke being especially clever or any one comedian being especially mean. That's about a shared cultural read that's become widespread enough to show up reliably across completely different comedy scenes, different generations of performers, and different national contexts. The Palace, true to form as always, says nothing about any of it, the way it has said nothing about practically every comedy roast directed their way for the last several years. Royal convention has always strongly preferred silence over engaging directly with criticism of any kind, and that restraint genuinely cuts both ways. It protects the institution from looking petty or thin-skinned by responding to every jab, every Family Guy cutaway, every late-night monologue, But it also means nobody from that side of the story is shaping the narrative in real time. Nobody is offering a counterframe. Nobody is pushing back even gently or correcting the record where it might genuinely need correcting. Which leaves the field wide open for whoever happens to be loudest in any given week, comedians very much included in that group, sometimes more influential on public perception than any official statement could ever be. And somewhere underneath all of this sits the question that actually matters more than any individual punchline, more than any single comedy special or awards show monologue. What happens to two actual children growing up in the middle of all of it? Archie and Lilibet will someday be old enough to find every interview, every documentary, every Family Guy cutaway gag, every Jimmy Carr bit specifically about their own family's line of succession and what would have to happen for their father to move closer to a throne. What that eventually does to how they understand their own family's story, their own place in all of this, is something nobody outside that house actually knows or can predict. The rest of us are just out here watching the comedy specials, laughing along or wincing along depending on where we land on it, while two kids who didn't ask for any of this grow up inside a story that gets retold a different way every single week, by a different comedian, on a different stage, for a different audience. That's not really anyone's fault in particular. It's just the genuine cost of how famous this family has become, separate from any of the individual jokes themselves. So that's where this whole thing lands tonight, a jam brand that practically writes its own punchlines without anyone having to work for it, a wax museum bit that somehow became one of the most quoted comedy moments of the entire year, complete with its own recurring fictional character, a Succession joke that got uncomfortably, deliberately close to something genuinely real underneath the dark humor, and an entire wall of comedians from every corner of the entertainment world, completely independently, arriving at roughly the same conclusion about where this couple currently sits in the public imagination right now. What's your take? Which one of these actually landed hardest for you? The Conan jam line that needed zero setup, the wax museum bit that somehow turned into a recurring character, Carr's uncomfortable Succession joke, or one of the Osbournes going completely unfiltered on national television? And honestly, do you think the comedy world piling on like this is fair game given everything this couple has put out into the public sphere themselves, or has it genuinely tipped over into something closer to pile-on territory at this point? I want to know specifically which bit made you actually laugh out loud versus which one made you wince a little, because I think there's a real split in this comment section waiting to happen. Drop it all in the comments. I read every single one of them, and they genuinely shape what we cover next on this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit like if any of this made you laugh even once, and I'll see you in the next one.